After 20 years of supporting my husband's career and sacrificing my own ambitions, I discovered his affair with his secretary through a misdirected text message. On the day he smugly announced he was leaving me for her, I watched his face crumble when I slid the property deed across the table and said, "You have 30 days to relocate your company. I'm tripling the rent." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I never expected to become the villain in someone else's love story. For 2 decades, I had been Rebecca Wilson, devoted wife, tireless supporter, the steady foundation upon which my husband built his empire. Now, according to the whispers circulating through Hartford's business community, I was the vindictive ex, the obstacle to true love, the woman who couldn't gracefully accept that her husband had found happiness with someone younger and more vibrant. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all, it was James who had betrayed our marriage vows. James who had carried on a months-long affair with his executive assistant. James who had planned to discard 20 years of partnership as casually as last season's suits. Yet somehow I had become the unreasonable one when I refused to simply disappear. The text message that unraveled my carefully constructed life arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in April. I was preparing dinner, braised short ribs, James's favorite, while simultaneously reviewing quarterly projections for my investment portfolio. Multitasking had become second nature during my marriage, balancing household management with the quiet cultivation of my financial interests that James had always regarded with benevolent condescension, as though my business acumen were an adorable hobby rather than the formidable skill that had quadrupled our net worth. When James's phone buzzed on the counter, I thought nothing of checking it. There had never been secrets between us, or so I believed. The message preview showed only, "Can't wait for tonight. Wearing that thing you love." From Melissa. His 29-year-old executive assistant with the marketing degree and perfect blowout. The woman who had been working increasingly late hours with my husband over the past 6 months. The woman who had sent me a lavish orchid arrangement just last month with a card praising James's mentorship. My hands didn't shake as I set down the phone. That surprised me. Instead, a curious calm descended as I methodically turned off the Y. Oven, covered the half-prepared meal, and walked to my home office. The practical part of my brain, the part that had quietly built a real estate portfolio while playing the role of corporate wife, took control. I spent the next 3 hours conducting a thorough investigation that would have impressed a federal prosecutor, email account timestamps, credit card statements, phone records, location history from the family sharing app that James had insisted we use for safety. The evidence mounted with each search, revealing not just an affair but a meticulously planned exit strategy from our marriage. Dinner reservations at intimate restaurants across town, hotel charges in neighboring cities disguised as business travel, a recently opened separate bank account, and most telling, an appointment with divorce attorney Lawrence Brennan scheduled for the following week. By the time I heard James's key in the lock at 10:30 p.m., I had compiled a comprehensive dossier of his betrayal and moved beyond shock to a cold, clarifying anger. "Becca?" he called, using the diminutive I had always disliked. "Sorry I'm so late. The Peterson account is becoming a nightmare." The Peterson account. The same excuse he'd used 3 times in the past 2 weeks. I wondered if he even tried to be creative with his lies anymore, or if he simply assumed I was too trusting, too stupid to question him. "Dinner's in the fridge," I replied, remaining in my office. "I ate hours ago." He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie with practiced weariness. At 48, James Wilson still cut an impressive figure, salt and pepper hair that enhanced rather than aged him, the physique maintained by the personal trainer I'd hired as his 40th birthday. "You're the confident posture of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room." "Working late?" he asked, gesturing to my computer screen, which now displayed the website for Brennan Legal Services. "What's this?" "Research," I said simply. I was curious about Lawrence Brennan's reputation. "Your appointment is next Thursday at 2 p.m., correct? Do you think he's the best choice for what you're planning?" The color drained from his face so rapidly I momentarily worried about his health. Then I remembered the $50,000 life insurance policy he'd recently taken out without discussing it with me, and my concern evaporated. "Becca, I can explain." "James," I interrupted, "please don't insult my intelligence with more lies. I know about Melissa. I know about the hotels. I know about all of it." He stared at me, recalibrating. I could almost see the mental calculations behind his eyes, the rapid assessment and adjustment of strategy that had made him so successful in business. The initial shock gave way to resignation, then, most tellingly, relief. "I didn't want you to find out this way," he said finally, his tone shifting to the controlled, reasonable voice he used during difficult negotiations. "I was going to talk to you after the Westlake merger closed. This isn't about you, Rebecca. It's about compatibility. About feeling alive again. Compatible enough to book the Riverside Suites under your corporate account 12 times in the past 4 months?" I asked mildly. "That must be quite the connection." His expression hardened. "I didn't expect you to understand. You've become so practical over the years, so focused on security and planning. Melissa reminds me of who I used to be before all this responsibility. Before I got trapped in this endless cycle of expectations." Trapped. The word echoed like a slap. 20 years of supporting his dreams, of relocating 3 times for his career opportunities, of hosting countless dinner parties for his clients, of enduring his family's subtle disdain, all reduced to a trap he needed to escape. "I see," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And were you planning to explain these feelings before or after your consultation with one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in the state?" He had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. "Lawrence was Melissa's idea. She thought it would be prudent to understand our options. This doesn't have to be adversarial, Rebecca. We can handle this like adults. A clean break, fair division of assets." "Fair," I repeated, tasting the word. "And what exactly does fair look like in your mind, James?" He sighed, adopting the patient tone he used when explaining complex concepts to subordinates. "The house is yours, naturally. I know how much you love it here. I'm prepared to be generous with alimony, at least until you find suitable employment. Perhaps something part-time that would give your days structure without being too demanding." The condescension nearly broke my composure. 20 years, and he still saw me as an ornamental accessory to his success, incapable of supporting myself without his benevolence. "How thoughtful," I remarked. "And your company?" "Wilson Consulting is our largest marital asset. I assume your generosity extends to an equitable division there as well." His expression shifted to alarm. "The company isn't on the table, Rebecca. That's my life's work, my identity. You've never shown the slightest interest in the business beyond attending the holiday parties." "Fascinating interpretation," I said. "Considering I provided the initial capital that funded your first 2 years of operation. Considering I managed the household finances that allowed you to reinvest every profit back into expansion. Considering I maintained the social connections that brought in half your client roster." "That was different," he protested. "That was support, not partnership. You've never understood the actual business." I smiled then, a genuine expression that seemed to unnerve him more than anger would have. "Perhaps we should table this discussion until we both have legal representation. I wouldn't want to say something that might complicate our clean break." Psst. He studied me warily, unused to this version of his accommodating wife. "That's probably wise. I'll sleep in the guest room tonight. Tomorrow, I'll look for a temporary apartment until this is resolved." "No need," I replied. "I've already reserved you a suite at the Madison Hotel. 3 weeks, fully paid. I thought you might appreciate the privacy, and they have an excellent room service menu. His eyes widened slightly. You've made arrangements already? How long have you known? Long enough to process my initial reaction, I said truthfully. I've never been one to make important decisions in the heat of emotion. Unlike some people in this marriage. As James packed an overnight bag, moving through our bedroom with awkward caution, I maintained my composure by mentally reviewing my next steps. The emergency meeting with my financial advisor scheduled for tomorrow morning. The appointment with Vanessa Carrington, a divorce attorney whose reputation made Lawrence Brennan look like a friendly mediator, set for tomorrow afternoon. The discreet inquiry I'd sent to a private investigator to verify what I already suspected about the Westlake merger and James's unusual financial movements over the past quarter. When he finally left, suitcase in hand and a mixture of guilt and impatience on his face, I allowed myself precisely 10 minutes to feel the full emotional impact of the day's revelations. 10 minutes to acknowledge the grief, humiliation, and rage that simmered beneath my controlled exterior. 10 minutes to mourn the death of a marriage I had believed in completely. When the timer I'd set chimed softly, I dried my eyes, squared my shoulders, and opened my laptop. Sentiment had its place, but strategy would be my salvation, and I had always excelled at strategy, even when James dismissed my business instincts as cute. The most valuable asset in my portfolio, the one James knew nothing about, was about to become the centerpiece of my response to his betrayal. The Grayson Building in downtown Hartford, purchased through my separate LLC 5 years ago when the commercial real estate market had temporarily plummeted. A prestigious address that housed multiple businesses, including the entirety of Wilson Consulting's operations on the top 3 floors. James had always assumed we leased the space through a standard commercial arrangement. He had signed the rental agreement without reading the fine print, trusting his office manager to handle the tedious details while he focused on big-picture thinking. He had no idea that his monthly payments had been flowing into my investment company for half a decade, or that the unusually favorable terms had been my silent contribution to his success. Now, those terms were about to change dramatically. I navigated to my secure document storage and reviewed the commercial lease agreement. As I suspected, it contained a change of ownership clause that would allow significant modifications with minimal notice. James had never bothered to have his corporate counsel review the contract. Another example of his selective attention to detail, meticulous about client agreements but careless about operational matters he deemed beneath his expertise. As I drafted the formal notice that would inform Wilson Consulting of its new rental terms, triple the current rate, effective in 30 days, I felt no vindictive pleasure. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. About finally stepping out of the shadows of supportive wife into the full light of my own capabilities. For 20 years, I had played by unspoken rules that placed James's ambitions above my own. I had sublimated my financial acumen into helpful suggestions and supportive management of our personal affairs. I had allowed him to believe that his success was entirely self-made, a narrative that fed his ego and maintained marital harmony. That accommodation had ended the moment he had decided our vows were optional, our partnership disposable when something more exciting came along. Now he would learn exactly whom he had chosen to discard. Not just a loyal wife, but a formidable businesswoman who had been his silent partner all along. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, legal complexities, and the public spectacle of our separation. The business community would buzz with speculation. Friends would choose sides. James's family would close ranks around him, rewriting our marital history to cast me as the villain who couldn't accept the natural conclusion of a loveless marriage. But tonight, as I finalized the notification letter and prepared for the battle, Ahead, I felt something unexpected beneath the hurt and anger. Liberation. The masks we had both worn were finally falling away. James would see me clearly for perhaps the first time in our relationship, and I would no longer diminish my capabilities to protect his ego. The woman who had entered this marriage, young, accommodating, eager to shape herself to fit the role of corporate wife, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer about her worth, and unwilling to be relegated to a footnote in someone else's success story. As I closed my laptop and moved through the silent house, the house James assumed would be my consolation prize, I made a promise to myself. This ending, painful as it was, would become the foundation for a new beginning. One where I no longer hid my light to make someone else shine brighter. The game had changed, and James was about to discover he had severely underestimated his opponent. The Madison Hotel's executive suite offered a commanding view of Hartford's skyline at dawn. I had been awake for hours, watching the city gradually illuminate as businesses came to life. Somewhere in that urban landscape, James was likely waking up disoriented, perhaps momentarily forgetting the seismic shift in our relationship before reality reasserted itself. I checked my watch, 6:30 a.m. My first meeting wasn't until 8, but preparation had always been the cornerstone of my approach to challenges. I opened my laptop and reviewed the comprehensive strategy document I had refined through the sleepless night. The plan was divided into 3 phases: protect, position, and proceed. Each contained detailed action items, contingency measures, and timeline projections. Some might consider such methodical planning cold in the face of emotional devastation. I saw it as necessary. Self-preservation. My phone chimed with a text message from Elaine Mercer, my closest friend and the only person I had confided in so far. "Breakfast in 20? You shouldn't be alone right now." I hesitated before responding. Elaine's concern was genuine, but I wasn't. Ready for the inevitable questions, the sympathetic looks, the well-intentioned comfort that would require me to acknowledge my vulnerability. Maintaining emotional discipline felt crucial at this juncture. "Rain check? Meeting with Richard at 8. We'll call later." Her response came immediately. "Understood. Remember, this is James's failure, not yours." The simple affirmation steadied me as I prepared for the day ahead. I selected a charcoal gray suit that I rarely wore. James had always preferred me in softer colors, claiming that severe tones didn't suit my nurturing personality. The tailored jacket and trousers felt like armor as I paired them with a crisp white blouse and the diamond studs that had been my grandmother's. Richard Davidson's office occupied a modest space in the financial district, deliberately understated to maintain the privacy his high-net-worth clients valued. As my personal financial advisor for 15 years, Richard was one of the few people who understood the full scope of my separate assets. He had been instrumental in guiding the quiet investments I had made while maintaining the fiction that James was our family's primary wealth builder. "Rebecca?" he greeted me, rising from behind his desk. His expression revealed nothing beyond professional concern. "I've cleared my morning as requested. How can I help?" I took the offered seat and went straight to the point. "James is leaving me for his assistant. He has an appointment with Lawrence Brennan next week to initiate divorce proceedings." Richard absorbed this information with a slight narrowing of his eyes, the only indication that this news surprised him. "I see. And you're here to discuss protection of your assets." "Precisely. I need to understand exactly where I stand financially. If this becomes adversarial..." He nodded and turned to his computer. "Let's start with the current state of affairs. Your personal portfolio, exclusive of jointly held assets, currently stands at approximately $12. $4 million, primarily in commercial real estate holdings and diversified investments. The most significant single asset being the Grayson Building, valued at $3 million based on our last assessment." "And James has no legal claim to these assets?" "Correct. Your LLC was established before your marriage, and you've maintained scrupulous separation between your personal investments and joint marital finances. All capital contributions came from your inheritance and premarital savings. Documentation is pristine. He paused, studying me. You've always been exceptionally careful about maintaining these boundaries, Rebecca. Almost as if you anticipated this situation. I smiled faintly. Not anticipated, just pragmatic. My father taught me to always maintain financial independence, regardless of marital status. Richard nodded. Your father was a wise man. Now, regarding the Grayson building specifically, you're aware that Wilson Consulting represents approximately 60% of the property's rental income? I am. I'm also aware that the lease agreement includes a change of control clause allowing for rate adjustments with 30 days' notice. It does, Richard confirmed, though exercising that option could potentially trigger a commercial dispute if implemented too aggressively. What would constitute too aggressive in legal terms? He considered this. A court might find tripling the rent overnight punitive rather than commercially reasonable. A phased increase would be more defensible. And if Wilson Consulting were to breach other terms of the lease agreement simultaneously, say, through unauthorized modifications to the space or misrepresentation of employee headcount? Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. You have evidence of such breaches? I removed a flash drive from my purse and placed it on his desk. The building management company conducts quarterly inspections. They've documented several violations over the past year that we chose not to pursue, given the personal relationship involved. He connected the drive to his computer and scanned the files quickly. This is substantial. Combined with the change of control provision, you have significant leverage. He leaned back, removing his glasses. Rebecca, may I speak frankly? Please. You're in an enviable position financially. Your personal assets exceed what most people accumulate in a lifetime. You could walk away from this marriage with your separate property intact and likely secure a favorable settlement regarding joint assets given James's infidelity. Fighting over the Grayson building and Wilson Consulting's tenancy might satisfy emotional needs, but it could also escalate tensions and prolong an already painful process. I appreciated Richard's candor, even as I rejected his implicit suggestion that my motivations were emotional rather than strategic. This isn't about punishing James, I clarified. It's about recognition. For 20 years, I've allowed him to believe that his success existed independent of my contributions. That ends now. Richard studied me for a moment before nodding. Then let's ensure you're positioned for success. I recommend we conduct a full audit of all jointly held assets immediately. If James was planning to consult with Brennan, he may have already begun moving funds or restructuring holdings. Already underway, I confirmed. I authorized our bank to freeze joint accounts temporarily due to suspicious activity. It buys us 72 hours to complete the assessment. Proactive as always, Richard commented, making notes. What about Wilson Consulting itself? As his spouse, you could potentially claim significant ownership interest despite not being formally involved in operations. That's my next appointment, Vanessa Carrington at 10:30. His expression shifted to grudging respect. Carrington doesn't take many clients these days. Her retainer must have been substantial. It was, I acknowledged. But her expertise in high-asset divorces involving closely held businesses is unmatched. I need someone who can go toe-to-toe with Brennan. She'll certainly accomplish that. Richard turned back to his computer. I'll prepare a comprehensive financial briefing for her by noon. In the meantime, I suggest you restrict access to your personal accounts and investments immediately. Change passwords, enable two-factor authentication, and notify your banks of the potential for unauthorized access attempts. Already done, I assured him, and I've instructed building management to revoke James's independent access credentials for the Grayson building. He can still enter Wilson Consulting's offices, but he'll need to check in with security rather than using his private elevator access. Richard's lips twitched in what might have been appreciation. You've been thorough. That doesn't surprise me. He hesitated before adding, How are you, Rebecca? Beyond the practical considerations? The question caught me off guard. Since discovering James's betrayal, I had channeled all my energy into action, strategic response, pragmatic planning. No one, not even Elaine, had asked about my emotional state so directly. I began, then paused, searching for an honest answer. I'm angry, hurt, humiliated that this was happening under my nose for months. But mostly, I'm determined not to let this define me. Richard nodded, his expression softening momentarily. For what it's worth, I've always thought James underestimated you. Perhaps now he'll understand exactly whom he's dealing with. As I left Richard's office, his words resonated more deeply than he likely intended. Being underestimated had been a constant theme in my marriage, not through active dismissal, but through subtle diminishment. James had never been cruel or explicitly demeaning. His undermining had been more insidious. The gentle steering away from business discussions at social events, the reflexive explanation of concepts I already understood, the automatic assumption that his judgment in financial matters superseded mine. I had allowed it, even embraced it at times. Playing the supportive wife had simplified our dynamics, reinforcing James's confidence while giving me freedom to pursue my own interests without scrutiny or competition. It had seemed a reasonable compromise for marital harmony. Now I recognized how that compromise had slowly eroded my visibility, not just to James but to our entire social circle. I had become background music in my own life, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. That invisibility ended today. Vanessa Carrington's office projected a different kind of power than Richard's understated space. Located in the II city's most prestigious high-rise, her reception area featured museum-quality artwork, custom furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing panoramic views. The message was clear: success entered here, and it didn't apologize for its ambition. Mrs. Wilson, the receptionist greeted me. Ms. Carrington is ready for you. Vanessa herself met me at her office door, a courtesy I knew she extended to few clients. At 58, she embodied formidable elegance, silver hair cut in a precise bob, impeccable tailoring, minimal but exquisite jewelry. Her reputation had been built on representing high-profile women in divorce proceedings, transforming potential victims into victors through meticulous strategy and uncompromising advocacy. Rebecca, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for coming. I've reviewed your preliminary documentation and must say you've done exceptional groundwork. Her office continued the theme of unapologetic success, with credentials and awards, prominently displayed alongside photographs of Vanessa with recognizable public figures. No family photos softened the space. This room was dedicated entirely to professional achievement. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, I replied, taking the offered seat. I understand your schedule is typically booked months in advance. Elaine Mercer's recommendation carries significant weight, she explained, referring to my friend who had made the introduction. And your situation presents interesting legal questions that appeal to my particular expertise. I appreciated her straightforward approach. No sympathetic platitudes, no comments about emotional well-being. Just professional assessment and strategic planning, exactly what I needed. Let's begin with your priorities, Vanessa continued, opening a leather portfolio. Beyond equitable division of assets, what outcome would represent success for you in these proceedings? The question was perfectly framed, not what I wanted, which implied emotional desire, but what would constitute success. A practical metric for a practical person. 3 things, I replied without hesitation. First, Recognition of my contributions to Wilson Consulting's success, both financial and operational. Second, protection of my separate assets, particularly the Grayson Building. Third, control over the narrative surrounding our separation. Vanessa made notes, nodding slightly. Let's address these in order. Regarding Wilson Consulting, despite your lack of formal title or operational role, we have strong arguments for substantial ownership interest. Your initial capital contribution, ongoing indirect support through management of personal finances that allowed reinvestment of business profits, and facilitation of key client relationships all constitute material contributions under Connecticut law. James will argue that these were simply the actions of a supportive spouse, not a business partner, I noted. Of course he will, Vanessa agreed. And in response, will present evidence of specific business decisions influenced by your input, documented instances where your social connections directly resulted in client acquisition, and financial records demonstrating how your separate income supplemented household expenses during the company's growth phase. She turned a page in her portfolio. Which brings us to the Grayson Building. Your position there is exceptionally strong. The property was acquired through your separate LLC, funded entirely by premarital assets and inherited funds. Documentation is impeccable. James has no viable claim to ownership interest. And the lease agreement with Wilson Consulting? I asked. Fascinating situation, Vanessa replied, a hint of professional appreciation in her tone. The company signed a standard commercial lease with your management company, apparently unaware of your connection to the property. The agreement includes standard provisions for rate adjustments, though as your financial advisor likely mentioned, implementation would need to be commercially reasonable to avoid claims of punitive action. Would the property's significance to Wilson Consulting's operations give James leverage in negotiation? The company has built its brand around that prestigious address. Vanessa's smile was slight, but unmistakable. Quite the opposite. The company's dependence on that specific location strengthens your position. Relocation would be exceptionally disruptive to their operations and client relationships. This creates substantial incentive for reasonable accommodation of new terms. She made another note before continuing. As for controlling the narrative, this is often the most challenging aspect of high-profile separations. James will likely attempt to characterize you as the vindictive spouse, using your business decisions as evidence of emotional reaction rather than legitimate commercial interests. He's already begun that positioning with friends, I confirmed, presenting himself as someone who regrettably fell in love with another woman after growing apart from his wife. A predictable approach, Vanessa observed. We'll counter with careful messaging that emphasizes your long-standing business acumen, your consistent financial independence throughout the marriage, and your reasonable approach to resolution. The goal isn't to win a public relations battle, but to maintain your professional reputation and personal dignity. She closed her portfolio, fixing me with a direct gaze. Rebecca, I must ask, are you prepared for how personal this will become? James and his counsel will likely seek to characterize your business decisions as emotionally motivated revenge. They may suggest that your separate financial activities during the marriage indicate a lack of commitment to the partnership. They will attempt to diminish your contributions to both the household and the business. I understand, I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. And yes, I'm prepared. Good, because I don't represent victims. I represent women who refuse to be victimized, women who understand that divorce is not merely the dissolution of a marriage, but a complex business transaction with significant long-term implications. Her words resonated deeply. I had spent too much of my marriage accommodating, compromising, diminishing my own light to maintain harmony. That approach had culminated in betrayal and dismissal. The time for accommodation had ended. One more question, Vanessa said, studying me carefully. When James realizes the full extent of your separate financial activities and the potential implications for his company, he may propose reconciliation. How would you respond to such an overture? The question caught me by surprise. In all my planning, I hadn't considered the possibility that James might attempt to salvage our marriage once he understood the financial consequences of its dissolution. The idea that he might suddenly rediscover his commitment when threatened with loss of control was both entirely plausible and profoundly disturbing. I haven't considered that scenario, I admitted. But I believe that any relationship restored through financial coercion rather than genuine remorse and respect would be fundamentally compromised. Vanessa nodded, seeming satisfied with my response. I agree. Now, here's what happens next. My office will prepare formal representation documents today. Once signed, we'll file an appearance with the court, putting Lawrence Brennan on notice that you have secured counsel. Simultaneously, we'll send preservation notices regarding all financial records, communications, and business documents. How quickly should I execute the lease modification for the Grayson building? I asked. Strategically, I recommend waiting until after our initial filing. Let James make the first aggressive move, likely freezing joint accounts or attempting to establish business assets as separate property. Then we respond with the lease modification as a legitimate business decision necessitated by changing circumstances. She stood, indicating our meeting was concluding. Rebecca, I want to be clear about something. My objective isn't merely to secure you an equitable financial settlement. It's to ensure you emerge from this process with your economic power intact and your agency uncompromised. Too many women sacrifice long-term position for short-term peace. I won't allow that to happen in your case. As I left Vanessa's office, her words crystallized something I had been feeling since discovering James's betrayal. This fight wasn't simply about dividing assets or extracting compensation for emotional harm. It was about refusing to be rendered invisible in my own life story. About asserting not just my financial worth, but my fundamental value as an equal partner, a capable strategist, a person of consequence. For 20 years, I had allowed James to be the protagonist in our shared narrative, accepting a supporting role out of love, habit, and societal expectation. That narrative was now being rewritten, not by James and his new relationship, but by my refusal to exit the stage quietly. The realization brought an unexpected sense of purpose that transcended anger or vindication. This was my opportunity to reclaim not just financial assets, but personal power, to emerge not as a discarded wife, but as a woman stepping fully into her capabilities after years of strategic patience. As my car navigated Hartford's midday traffic, my phone rang with James's distinctive tone. I let it go to voicemail, not yet ready for direct engagement. The message he left was predictably James, a mixture of practiced contrition and implicit accusation. Rebecca, we need to talk. The hotel has informed me that my reservation ends tomorrow, not in 3 weeks as you indicated. Also, my building access card was rejected this morning. These punitive actions aren't helping anyone. Please call me so we can discuss a civilized approach to this situation. I smiled faintly at his characterization of basic boundary setting as punitive. James had always excelled at framing his preferences as reasonable while labeling others' boundaries as excessive or emotional. It was a pattern I had noticed early in our marriage, but had dismissed as a harmless quirk rather than the manipulative tactic it truly was. The next 48 hours would be critical in establishing the tone for our separation. James would be consulting with Lawrence Brennan, forming a strategy based on assumptions about my likely response. Those assumptions would be shaped by 20 years of observing my accommodating behavior, my preference for harmony over confrontation, my willingness to concede ground to maintain peace. He was about to discover how profoundly he had misunderstood the woman he had married, and more importantly, the woman she had become. The following morning, I awoke before my alarm, my mind already cycling through the day's objectives. 3 days had passed since discovering James's betrayal, and each hour had been meticulously allocated to strategic preparation. Today would mark our first direct confrontation since that initial night, a meeting James had requested with increasing urgency through a series of progressively frustrated messages. I had deliberately delayed this conversation, partly to complete my preparatory work, but also to allow James to experience the discomfort of uncertainty. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, the inability to immediately access his wife for explanation or absolution was psychologically significant. It shifted power dynamics in subtle but important ways. My phone chimed with a text from Vanessa Carrington. Documents filed, Brennan served, preservation notices. Delivered to Wilson Consulting Offices. Proceed as discussed. Perfect timing. The legal groundwork was now established, creating the framework within which our meeting would occur. James would be operating from a position of reaction rather than initiative, another subtle but meaningful advantage. I dressed deliberately, selecting a sapphire blue suit I had purchased during a business trip to Milan last year, a trip James had dismissed as your little shopping vacation, despite my attendance at a global investment conference. The outfit projected confidence and authority without aggression, precisely the tone I intended to establish. The Hartford Club seemed an appropriate venue for our discussion, neutral territory with sufficient privacy, yet public enough to discourage extreme emotional displays. James had suggested meeting at his temporary apartment, an overture I had immediately declined. The setting of our conversation would not be his domain. I arrived 15 minutes early, secured a private corner table in the main dining room, and ordered a sparkling water. James valued punctuality and would expect me to be precisely on time, neither early, which might suggest eagerness, nor late, which he would interpret as passive aggression. By altering this small pattern, I continued the subtle message that established expectations no longer applied. He appeared at exactly 11:30, scanning the room briefly before spotting me. Even from a distance I could read his expression, the momentary confusion at finding me already present and settled, followed by the recalibration that had become his constant state since my discovery. "Rebecca," he greeted me, leaning down, as if to kiss my cheek before registering my slight withdrawal and adjusting to offer his hand instead. "Thank you for meeting me. You look different." "Do I?" I replied mildly, gesturing for him to take a seat. "I feel remarkably clear." "How are you, James?" His momentary hesitation revealed he had prepared for a different opening, perhaps accusations or emotional appeals that would allow him to position himself as the reasonable party managing an overwrought spouse. "I've been better," he admitted, signaling for the waiter. "Scotch, neat," he ordered, before returning his attention to me. "This situation has become unnecessarily complicated. I thought we could have a civilized conversation about moving forward amicably." "I'm very interested in hearing your definition of amicable under the circumstances," I replied, maintaining a pleasant expression. "Especially given your consultation with Lawrence Brennan yesterday. How did that go?" His eyes narrowed slightly, the first indication that my knowledge of his movements unsettled him. "It was preliminary," he hedged, "standard procedure in these situations." "As was my meeting with Vanessa Carrington," I noted casually. "Also standard procedure." The name registered immediately. James's carefully maintained composure faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Carrington seems excessive for an uncontested divorce, Rebecca. She has a reputation for scorched earth approaches that benefit no one except the attorneys collecting fees." "Interesting perspective," I observed. "Though I wonder why you would characterize this as uncontested when you initiated consultation with counsel before even informing me of your intention to end our marriage." His drink arrived, and he took a deliberate sip before responding. "I was trying to be prepared, to ensure the process would be as painless as possible for both of us." "How considerate," I replied, my tone neutral. planning the dismantling of our 20-year marriage, while conducting an affair with your executive assistant certainly demonstrates thoughtful preparation. James exhaled slowly, attempting to project patience rather than the frustration I could see building behind his practiced expression. Rebecca, I didn't come here to rehash painful details or assign blame. What happened with Melissa? It wasn't planned. Sometimes connections develop that we don't anticipate. I never intended to hurt you. I allowed a moment of silence to extend between us, studying the man I had dedicated 2 decades of my life to. His explanation was perfectly calibrated, acknowledging wrongdoing while simultaneously suggesting it was somehow inevitable, beyond his control. The subtext was clear. Reasonable people accept that marriages sometimes end, and dignified women don't create messy scenes about infidelity. I appreciate your perspective, I said finally, and I agree that assigning blame isn't productive. I'm more interested in understanding what you envision as an amicable resolution. Relief flickered across his features, misinterpreting my calm response as acceptance. I've given this considerable thought, he began, shifting into his presentation mode, the tone and rhythm he used when proposing solutions to clients. You retain the house naturally, along with its contents excluding my personal items and office equipment. I'll provide generous support for 3 years, sufficient time for you to establish yourself professionally if you choose to work. We divide the investment accounts equally, with adjustments for tax implications. Clean, simple, fair. And Wilson Consulting? I asked, my voice still pleasant. His expression hardened slightly. The business isn't part of this discussion, Rebecca. It's my life's work, built through my expertise and client relationships. You've never been involved operationally. I nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting characterization of a company, initially funded with $250,000 from my personal savings. A company whose first office was established in our guest house, rent-free, with utilities and expenses covered by our joint household account, which was primarily funded by my inheritance during those early years. James's knuckles whitened around his glass. That was startup support between spouses, not a business investment. You've been well compensated for that temporary assistance through the lifestyle my success has provided. I see, I replied, maintaining my composure. And would you characterize the Weston account as temporary assistance as well? Or the Blackridge portfolio? Or the Eastman merger that doubled your client base 3 years ago? Confusion flickered across his face. What are you talking about? The Weston account, your largest client until the recent Westlake acquisition, secured through my introduction to Elizabeth Weston at the Symphony fundraiser. The Blackridge portfolio that you were pursuing unsuccessfully for 8 months until I mentioned your services to Thomas Blackridge during the hospital charity gala. The Eastman merger that I facilitated through my connections with their board chair. James stared at me, recalibrating yet again. Those were social introductions, Rebecca. The actual business relationships were developed through my professional expertise. Certainly, I agreed pleasantly. Your expertise was essential, as was my strategic network development, which provided access to decision-makers you couldn't reach independently. A classic partnership model. You managed execution while I facilitated opportunity. His expression tightened with growing wariness. This wasn't the conversation he had prepared for. The accommodating wife, willing to accept crumbs from the marital table, had been replaced by someone calmly asserting her value. Even if I acknowledged those contributions, he said carefully, they represent a fraction of the company's overall development. Certainly not enough to justify any ownership claim. I smiled then, reaching for my purse. That brings us to the other matter I wanted to discuss. I removed a sealed envelope and placed it on the table between us. You should review this before we continue. James eyed the envelope suspiciously. What is this? The revised lease terms for Wilson Consulting's offices in the Grayson Building, effective 30 days from yesterday's delivery to your corporate headquarters. He froze, confusion evident. What are you talking about? We lease from Grayson Commercial Properties. This has nothing to do with our personal situation. Grayson Commercial Properties is a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Investments, LLC, I explained calmly. Which is, in turn, my personal investment. Vehicle established prior to our marriage and maintained separately throughout. James stared at me, disbelief giving way to dawning comprehension. You're saying you're our landlord? That's not possible. I would know if we were leasing from a company connected to you. Would you? You signed the original lease agreement and 3 subsequent renewals. Did you ever read beyond the rate terms and standard provisions? Did you ever question why the renewal terms were so favorable in a market experiencing consistent appreciation? Or did you simply assume that your natural business acumen had secured advantageous terms? With deliberate movements, James opened the envelope and scanned its contents. I watched the color drain from his face as he processed the implications. The revised terms tripled the current lease rate, bringing it to approximately 20% above market value for comparable properties. This is vindictive, he said finally, his voice low but intense. Using a technicality to punish me for ending a marriage that hasn't been working for either of us. Not vindictive, I corrected gently. Simply business. Grayson Commercial Properties has maintained below-market rates for Wilson Consulting based on personal considerations that no longer apply. The revised terms reflect current market conditions, plus a premium for the prestige address and recent building upgrades. James pushed the document away, anger replacing shock. You know Wilson Consulting can't absorb a 300% increase in occupancy costs overnight. This would cripple our operations during the crucial Westlake integration phase. I imagine it would. Present challenges, I acknowledged. Though perhaps less severe than you suggest, given the company's strong cash position and the $2 million in contingency reserves established last quarter. His eyes narrowed at my knowledge of the company's internal finances. You've been investigating the business, preparing for this ambush. I've been aware of Wilson Consulting's financial position throughout our marriage, James. Just as I've been aware of the Grayson Building's value to your operations. The prestige location featured prominently in your marketing materials. The custom renovations designed specifically for your workflow. The client entertainment space on the top floor that's become central to your closing strategy. These aren't coincidences. They're deliberate investments I made in your success while you remained unaware of my role. James stared at me as if seeing a stranger. In many ways, he was. The woman sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the supportive wife he had taken for granted, the woman whose business acumen he had patronizingly admired while never truly respecting. What do you want? He asked finally, his tone shifting from anger to calculation. If this is about increasing the settlement, we can discuss reasonable adjustments. This isn't a negotiating tactic, James. It's a reality you'll need to incorporate into your planning, both personal and professional. Wilson Consulting has 30 days to either accept the new terms or provide notice of intent to vacate. You can't be serious, he protested. You know what a disruption relocation would cause. Clients would question our stability. The Westlake integration would be compromised. We could lose millions in value during a critical growth phase. All valid concerns, I agreed. Which makes the decision matrix relatively straightforward. Accept the market-adjusted lease terms, or absorb the considerably higher costs and disruption of relocation. A standard business calculation. James fell silent, reassessing the situation and his limited options. I could almost see the mental computations behind his eyes, the recognition that fighting the lease terms would be costly and likely unsuccessful. That relocation would be even more expensive and potentially devastating to client confidence. that his carefully planned exit from our marriage had suddenly become immeasurably more complicated. "You've been planning this," he said finally, accusation hardening his tone. "For how long? Was this some elaborate trap from the beginning?" "No trap, James. Simply independent financial management, something I was raised to value and maintain regardless of marital status. The Grayson Building was an investment opportunity that aligned with my portfolio strategy when it became available 5 years ago. The fact that it housed your company was certainly a factor in my decision-making, but hardly the primary motivation. And you never thought to mention this substantial investment to your husband? That level of secrecy seems calculated. Did you consider it necessary to inform me before pursuing Melissa?" I countered, my composure finally showing the first hairline fracture. "Or before consulting with divorce counsel? Or before making plans to dismantle our marriage while maintaining the pretense of partnership?" His gaze dropped momentarily, the closest thing to acknowledgement of wrongdoing I was likely to receive. When he looked up again, his expression had shifted from anger to something more calculating. "We've both made mistakes," he offered, his tone softening into the conciliatory register he used when negotiating from a position of weakness. "Perhaps this situation presents an opportunity to reconsider our path forward. 20 years of shared history shouldn't be discarded without exploring all options for reconciliation." I had anticipated this pivot, the tactical retreat when frontal confrontation proved unsuccessful. James had always been adaptable in business negotiations, willing to change strategies when initial approaches failed. That he would apply the same flexibility to our marriage was predictable, if disappointing. "Reconciliation," I repeated, testing the word. "An interesting proposal, given your relationship with Melissa and your explicit statements about incompatibility just days ago. What's changed?" He leaned forward, adopting an expression of earnest sincerity. "Perspective, Rebecca. Sometimes we don't fully appreciate what we have until we're faced with losing it. The past few days have given me time to reflect on the value of our partnership, both personally and professionally," I supplied when he hesitated. "Financially?" A flash of irritation crossed his features before he controlled it. "That's unfair. Yes, there are practical considerations, but my concern is primarily for your well-being. This adversarial approach benefits neither of us. Surely we can find a path forward that acknowledges both our contributions and preserves what we've built together." The transformation was remarkable. From a man confidently ending his marriage for a younger woman to one advocating reconciliation within the span of a single conversation. Not because of renewed affection or regret over the pain he'd caused, but because the financial equations had shifted dramatically. "James," I said quietly, "do you remember our 10th anniversary?" The apparent non sequitur caught him off guard. "Of course, we went to the Caymans, the beachfront resort. And do you remember what you gave me?" He frowned slightly, searching his memory. "The sapphire necklace. You're wearing the earrings that matched it now." I nodded. "The necklace was beautiful, but what I really remember is what you said when you gave it to me. You said, 'Every successful man needs a beautiful wife to showcase his achievements.' Not, 'I love you,' or 'Thank you for 10 wonderful years,' but a statement about how I functioned as an accessory to your success narrative." James shifted uncomfortably. "That was a poorly worded compliment, not a reflection of how I valued you." "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But it was honest, more honest than you realized. And it reflected a fundamental truth about our relationship that I accepted for far too long. I was an accessory, an asset, a supporting character in the James Wilson success story, never a true partner whose contributions were recognized or respected." "That's not fair," he protested. "I always appreciated your support." You appreciated the benefits of my presence without acknowledging their value, I corrected. You enjoyed the doors my social connections opened while dismissing the strategic networking as your charity work. You utilized the financial stability my inheritance provided while characterizing my investment decisions as cute hobbies. You accepted my input on business challenges when it served you, then repackaged those insights as your own innovative thinking. James stared at me, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his features: defensive anger, reluctant recognition, calculation of his rapidly diminishing options. What happens now? He asked finally. Now we proceed with the dissolution of our marriage through proper legal channels. Vanessa Carrington will communicate with Lawrence Brennan regarding next steps. Wilson Consulting has 30 days to notify Grayson Commercial Properties of its intentions regarding the revised lease terms. And us? After 20 years, does it end with lawyers and property managers? The question held a note of genuine regret that momentarily penetrated my carefully maintained composure. Despite everything, there was a shared history between us, moments of connection, of joy, of partnership, however imbalanced that partnership had been. Our marriage ended the moment you decided Melissa represented a more appealing future, I said quietly. My financial decisions are simply the natural consequence of your choices, not their cause. James nodded slowly, the final acknowledgement that reconciliation was not a viable path. I underestimated you, he said, a mixture of bitterness and reluctant admiration in his voice. All these years. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. He signaled for the check. His professional mask reasserted itself, the affable, confident businessman visible to the outside world, regardless of private turmoil. I'll have accounting review the lease terms. Perhaps there's room for reasonable accommodation that serves both our interests. Perhaps, I allowed, gathering my purse and standing. Grayson Commercial Properties is always open to good faith negotiations with valued tenants. The subtle emphasis on good faith wasn't lost on him. His gaze held mine for a moment, communicating understanding that future interactions would be conducted on fundamentally different terms than our previous dynamics. As I walked away from the table, I felt no triumph or vindication, only a peculiar lightness, as though I had set down a burden I had carried for so long that its weight had become normalized. The woman who had entered the restaurant was not the same one leaving it. The transformation wasn't about asserting power over James or punishing his betrayal. It was about refusing to diminish myself any longer for someone else's comfort or convenience. Outside, spring sunshine had broken through the morning clouds, warming the city after days of overcast skies. I paused on the sidewalk, taking a moment to appreciate the simple pleasure of light on my face, of standing fully in my own truth after years of strategic accommodation. My phone chimed with a message from Elaine. Check in when you can. Thinking of you today. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I felt ready for genuine connection rather than strategic consultation. Not to seek comfort or reassurance, but to share this emerging version of myself with someone who had always seen my capabilities more clearly than my husband had. Lunch? I texted back. I have quite a story to tell you. As I waited for her response, I realized that the path ahead, while legally complex and emotionally challenging, offered something I hadn't anticipated when I first read that misdirected text message: freedom. Not just from a marriage built on unequal recognition and respect, but from the constrained version of myself I had accepted as necessary for harmony. That freedom was worth every difficult conversation, every legal maneuver, every moment of painful recognition ahead. It was, perhaps, the most valuable asset I would retain from 20 years with James Wilson. The reclamation of my full self, no longer diminished to accommodate someone else's narrative. And that was a return on investment beyond calculation. The cafe Elaine had suggested for our lunch meeting reflected her personality perfectly. Elegant without pretension, comfortable yet refined. Located in the West End neighborhood, away from the financial district where James and I typically dined, it offered a welcome separation from familiar routines. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt a subtle but significant shift in perspective, as though physically removing myself from our usual haunts allowed me to see my situation with greater clarity. Elaine was already seated at a corner table, her silver-streaked dark hair instantly recognizable even in the crowded space. At 53, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who had navigated her own path through professional success and personal challenges. A high-profile architect with her own firm, she had been widowed at 35 when her husband suffered a sudden heart attack, then raised their daughter alone while building her business into one of Hartford's most respected design studios. Our friendship had been one of the few relationships in my life untainted by my marriage's unequal dynamics. With Elaine, I had never felt the need to downplay my intelligence or strategic thinking. Perhaps that was why she had recognized signs of trouble in my marriage long before I had acknowledged them myself. "Rebecca," she stood to embrace me, stepping back to assess me with the architect's eye for detail. "You look formidable." "Blue suits you." "Thank you," I replied, settling into the chair across from her. It felt appropriate today. A server appeared with water and menus, but Elaine waved them away with practiced ease. "We'll have the spring salads and the salmon tartine to share," she instructed before turning back to me. I took the liberty of ordering ahead. I suspected this conversation might be too important for menu deliberations. I smiled at her characteristic efficiency. "You know me well." "Well enough to recognize when something significant has shifted," she confirmed, studying my expression. "The last time we spoke, you were in tactical mode, all strategy and logistics. Today there's something different about you." "I met with James this morning," I explained, filling her in on the confrontation at the Hartford Club, his reaction to discovering my ownership of the Grayson building, and his transparent attempt at reconciliation when the financial implications became clear. Elaine listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing until I had finished. Then she sat back, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You magnificent creature," she said finally. "I've been waiting 20 years to see this version of you emerge." Her words caught me by surprise. "What do you mean?" "Rebecca, I've watched you shrink yourself for 2 decades to accommodate James's ego. You've downplayed your intelligence, hidden your business acumen, and presented the acceptable corporate wife facade while secretly building your own empire. It was masterfully done, but painful to witness." I felt a momentary defensiveness rise at her characterization. "It wasn't intentional deception. I simply learned which aspects of myself created harmony in our marriage and which created friction." "And that's exactly the problem," Elaine countered gently. "You shouldn't have needed to curate yourself to maintain harmony with someone who claimed to love you. True partnership doesn't require one person to diminish themselves for the other to feel adequate." Her assessment struck a chord of truth I wasn't fully prepared to acknowledge. "You make it sound calculated on my part, like I was deliberately presenting a false version of myself." "Not false," she corrected. "Incomplete. And not from manipulation, but from accommodation, a pattern many women adopt without conscious decision. We sense which parts of ourselves create discomfort in our partners and gradually minimize those aspects until they become almost invisible, even to ourselves." Our food arrived, providing a welcome moment to process her insights. As we began eating, I considered how accurately Elaine had identified patterns I had never fully articulated, even to myself. "When did you first notice this happening in my marriage?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Elaine considered the question thoughtfully. There were early signals, but the clearest example came about 5 years into your marriage. You had developed that brilliant strategy for diversifying your investment portfolio during the market downturn. The approach that ultimately increased your assets by 40% when everyone else was losing ground? I nodded, remembering the careful research and counterintuitive decisions that had indeed yielded exceptional returns during a challenging financial period. You were so excited about it, Elaine continued. You explained the whole strategy to me over lunch, and your understanding of market patterns was legitimately impressive. Then James joined us unexpectedly, and in an instant, I watched you transform. Your voice changed pitch, your body language shifted, and when he asked what we were discussing so animatedly, you said, "Shopping strategies for the charity auction." I finished, the memory suddenly crystal clear. I remember that day. From that moment, I knew you were hiding significant parts of yourself to maintain marital peace. The question was why? Why would an intelligent, capable woman like you feel the need to conceal her capabilities from her own husband? I considered her question carefully. It wasn't a conscious decision, at least not initially. But early in our marriage, I noticed that James became uncomfortable when I demonstrated certain kinds of knowledge or capability. Not overtly critical, but subtly dismissive or competitive. It was easier to keep those aspects of myself private than to constantly navigate his reactions. And in that privacy, you built something remarkable, Elaine observed. Your separate investments, your property holdings, your strategic network, all developed in the shadow of a marriage that didn't fully accommodate your capabilities. I.e., when you phrase it that way, it sounds rather sad, I noted. Or rather triumphant, depending on perspective, she countered. You didn't allow his limitations to constrain your growth. You simply created a parallel track for the aspects of yourself that couldn't flourish within the marriage. Now those parallel paths have converged in a moment of perfect clarity for both of you. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of coffee. As the server departed, Elaine leaned forward, her expression serious. "Rebecca, may I ask you something deeply personal?" "Of course." "Are you mourning the end of your marriage, or simply processing the logistics of its dissolution? I haven't heard you express grief over losing James himself." The question struck at something I had been avoiding confronting directly. In all my strategic planning and practical arrangements, I had focused on protecting assets and positioning myself advantageously. I had processed anger over betrayal and indignation over disrespect. But had I grieved for the relationship itself? I'm not sure, I admitted. There's certainly grief for the future I thought we would share. Retirement plans, travel dreams, the life we had mapped out together. There's grief for the history we built, the shared memories and experiences. But grief for James himself. I paused, searching for honest words. I think that grief happened incrementally over years, as I gradually recognized that the partnership I wanted wasn't the one I had. By the time I discovered his affair, the emotional separation was already substantial. Elaine nodded, understanding. That's often how it happens. The legal dissolution merely formalizes an emotional reality that developed gradually over time. What disturbs me most, I continued, finding relief in articulating thoughts I hadn't fully examined, is wondering whether our entire marriage was fundamentally misrepresented from the beginning. Did James ever truly see me, or only the version of me that served his narrative? Did he marry me for who I was, or for who he thought I would be in relation to his ambitions? Does the answer to that question change your path forward? Elaine asked pragmatically. No, I acknowledged, but it affects how I interpret 20 years of shared history. Then perhaps the most generous approach is to accept the complexity of human relationships. James likely loved aspects of you genuinely, while also valuing how you enhanced his life narrative. Few partnerships are purely authentic or purely transactional. Most exist in the nuanced territory between. Her perspective offered a compassionate framework that allowed me to honor what had been genuine in our connection while acknowledging its limitations. It was a more balanced view than either complete vilification or romantic idealization, and it resonated with my own emerging understanding. "What happens next for you?" Elaine asked after a comfortable silence. "Beyond the legal proceedings and financial negotiations." The question was both simple and profound. For 20 years, my identity had been partially defined by my relationship to James, my decisions influenced by their impact on our shared life. Now I faced the prospect of defining myself solely on my own terms, an exhilarating and slightly disorienting proposition. "Professionally, I've been considering formalizing my investment activities into a proper advisory firm," I said, giving voice to an ambition I had previously kept private. "I've maintained an informal client base for years, friends and their referrals whose portfolios I've managed alongside my own. With proper structure and perhaps a small team, I could expand that significantly." "That's perfect," Elaine responded, her enthusiasm genuine. "You've always had exceptional insight into market patterns and value opportunities. Why keep that talent confined to your personal investments?" "There's also the Grayson building itself," I continued, warming to the conversation. "I've been approached several times about joining the downtown revitalization initiative. With more time and focus, I could take a more active role in shaping the neighborhood's development beyond simply owning property within it." "The community would benefit tremendously from your involvement," Elaine noted, "especially given your commitment to balancing economic growth with cultural preservation." As we discussed these possibilities, I felt a growing sense of anticipation, replacing the controlled determination that had carried me through the past week. These weren't merely contingency plans to occupy me after divorce. They were expressions of long-standing interests and capabilities that had never received full cultivation within the constraints of my marriage. "You know," Elaine observed, watching me closely, "this is the most animated I've seen you discuss professional aspirations in years. Not because you haven't had them, but because you've habitually downplayed them in conversation." Her observation startled me with its accuracy. I had indeed developed the habit of discussing my financial activities in modest terms, describing significant investment decisions as little projects and strategic acquisitions as interesting opportunities. The language of diminishment had become so natural, I no longer recognized its presence in my self-description. "Old habits," I acknowledged. "Patterns established when maintaining harmony meant minimizing accomplishments that might provoke comparison." "And now?" Elaine prompted. "Now those patterns no longer serve any purpose," I replied, the realization both obvious and profound. "There's no relationship requiring the careful management of my capabilities, no ego requiring protection through my restraint." "Precisely," Elaine said, satisfaction evident in her voice. "This is the silver lining of James's betrayal. It's freed you from accommodations you didn't even recognize you were making. The question is whether you'll embrace that freedom fully or recreate similar constraints in your new circumstances." Her challenge was gentle but direct. Would I carry the habits of self-diminishment into my post-marriage life, continuing to moderate my ambitions and capabilities out of ingrained patterns? Or would I fully embody the uncompromised version of myself that was now possible? "I've been thinking about visibility," I said, following the thread of insight her question had provoked. "For years, I've operated behind the scenes, building my investments quietly, exercising influence through subtle channels, achieving results without claiming credit. That approach served specific purposes within my marriage, but it's no longer necessary or beneficial. So what does visibility look like for you going forward?" Elaine asked, speaking at investment conferences instead of merely attending them. "Publishing analysis under my own name rather than sharing insights privately. Joining boards and initiatives as a principal rather than a supporter." The possibilities expanded as I articulated them, each one revealing another area where I had unnecessarily limited my engagement. And personally? Elaine pressed gently. Beyond professional visibility? The question touched something more vulnerable than career aspirations. That's less clear, I admitted. I'm not sure I know who Rebecca Wilson is outside the context of her marriage. Or rather, Rebecca Harrington again, I suppose. Reclaiming your maiden name? I nodded. It feels appropriate. A return to my original identity before adding layers of accommodation. Identity isn't reclaimed, Rebecca. It's continuously created, Elaine observed. You're not reverting to who you were before James. You're becoming someone new who incorporates all you've learned and experienced without the constraints that limited your previous expression. Her framing resonated deeply, offering a more expansive vision than simply returning to a previous version of myself. This wasn't about restoration, but evolution, building upon foundations that had remained solid despite the compromises constructed above them. As we finished our meal, the conversation shifted to more immediate practical matters. The progression of divorce proceedings, the management of social connections who would inevitably take sides, the logistics of establishing separate households after decades of shared space. James will attempt to control the narrative, Elaine cautioned as we prepared to leave. He's already positioning himself as the reasonable party seeking amicable resolution while you pursue vindictive financial penalties. I'm aware, I acknowledged. Vanessa has advised a very specific approach to public messaging. Minimal discussion of personal details, consistent focus on equitable division of marital assets, and professional courtesy in all interactions. Perfect strategy, Elaine agreed. But be prepared for unexpected emotional responses when mutual friends choose sides, or when you encounter spaces and activities previously shared with James. The psychological impact often hits at unanticipated moments even when the rational mind is fully prepared. Her warning came from experience, the hard-earned wisdom of navigating her own life transition, albeit through widowhood rather than divorce. I appreciated her foresight in preparing me for challenges I might not have anticipated. How did you do it? I asked as we stood outside the cafe, preparing to go our separate ways. Rebuild your identity after losing someone who had been integral to it for so long? Elaine considered the question thoughtfully. Not by retreating to safety or familiar patterns, she said finally. The temptation after profound disruption is to seek comfort in the known, to minimize further change when so much has already shifted. I did the opposite, accepted a major international project, redesigned our home completely, developed new friendships outside our established social circle, not to escape grief, but to ensure it didn't define my future. Her advice captured something essential about navigating major life transitions. The importance of deliberate creation rather than passive acceptance or reactive response. I had approached the practical aspects of my separation with strategic intention. Perhaps the emotional and identity dimensions required equal purposefulness. Thank you, I said, embracing her with genuine gratitude. For lunch, for perspective, and for seeing capabilities in me that I sometimes forget to recognize myself. That's what friends do, she replied simply. Remind us of our whole selves when circumstances have led us to forget certain parts. As I drove back to the hotel, Elaine's insights continued to resonate. The past week had been consumed with responding to James's betrayal, protecting assets, establishing legal positioning, managing immediate logistics. Those responses had been necessary and appropriate, but they remained fundamentally reactive. The path forward would require something different, proactive creation of a life defined by my own vision rather than in relation to someone else's limitations. My phone rang through the car's speaker system, displaying Vanessa Carrington's office number. I accepted the call, curious about developments since our last communication. Rebecca, Vanessa's precise voice filled the car. Are you available? To speak? Yes, I'm alone in my car, What's happened? Lawrence Brennan has requested an emergency settlement conference. Apparently, James is interested in resolving matters quickly and privately, before financial disclosures become part of the public record. I smiled slightly at the transparent motivation. I imagine the Westlake investors would be quite interested to learn that Wilson Consulting's headquarters situation is suddenly precarious. Precisely, Vanessa confirmed. Also, preliminary investigation suggests the company's financial statements have overstated asset values while understating certain liabilities. Nothing outright fraudulent, but creative accounting that wouldn't withstand close scrutiny during discovery. This information didn't particularly surprise me. James had always displayed selective attention to financial regulations, viewing them as guidelines rather than absolute requirements. His approach typically involved pushing boundaries while maintaining plausible deniability, operating in gray areas without crossing into clearly illegal territory. What are you recommending? I asked. Agree to the conference but establish clear parameters. We enter with full financial disclosure already prepared on our side and expect the same from them. No preliminary negotiations or informal discussions. Everything documented from the outset. Timeline? They've requested Friday morning. I've tentatively accepted pending your availability. 2 days away, enough time for additional preparation but soon enough to maintain momentum. Friday works. What else should I know? James has retained Caroline Mueller as co-counsel alongside Brennan. This detail was interesting. Caroline Mueller specialized in business valuation disputes, particularly for closely held companies during divorce proceedings. Her involvement suggested James was preparing to vigorously contest any claim I might make to Wilson Consulting's value. A defensive move, I observed. He's anticipating our strategy regarding the business. And telegraphing his priorities, Vanessa agreed. They'll fight hardest on company valuation and ownership interest. We can use that knowledge to structure our approach. We discussed tactical details for several more minutes before concluding the call. As I continued toward the hotel, I felt a curious sense of detachment from the legal maneuvering. The practical aspects of divorcing James, the division of assets, the negotiation of financial terms, seemed almost secondary to the more profound separation that had already occurred within me. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal 1 week ago had been shocked, hurt, angry. The woman driving through Hartford today felt something different. A growing recognition that the end of her marriage, painful as it was, had created space for expansion rather than merely loss. James's affair with Melissa had not destroyed something perfect. It had simply revealed the fundamental imbalance that had existed all along. His reaction to discovering my financial independence and business acumen had further confirmed that our partnership had never truly accommodated my full capabilities. The marriage that was ending had constrained aspects of myself that could now emerge without apology or moderation. As I arrived at the hotel, a text message from James appeared on my phone. We need to discuss Wilson Consulting's lease situation before Friday's settlement conference. Neutral location tomorrow, 1 p.m. The request was predictable. Having failed to manipulate me through appeals to our marital history, James would now attempt to separate the business issues from personal ones, positioning himself as the reasonable executive protecting his company while I was the vindictive ex-wife threatening corporate stability. I deliberately delayed my response, providing a subtle reminder that his timeline priorities no longer automatically dictated my schedule. After checking my calendar, I texted back, 3 p.m. works, the Riverside Cafe. His response came immediately. Too public for sensitive business discussion. My attorney's office would be more appropriate. The Riverside Cafe at 3 p.m. or we address all matters directly at Friday's settlement conference, I countered. A longer pause followed before his capitulation. Fine. Riverside at 3. The brief exchange illustrated the shifting power dynamics between us. Throughout our marriage, James had controlled the when, where, and how of significant conversations. Meeting locations, timing, and conditions had been established according to his preferences and convenience, with my accommodation assumed rather than requested. Now, each interaction represented an opportunity to establish new patterns, not through petty control or arbitrary demands, but through straightforward assertion of equal standing in determining how our separation would proceed. As I entered my hotel suite, I noticed James had sent a final message. "This adversarial approach helps no one, Rebecca. We both stand to lose if this continues." The implied threat was characteristic, the suggestion that my failure to accommodate his preferences would result in mutual damage, as though the responsibility for harmony rested entirely on my willingness to concede. For years, I had accepted this framing, prioritizing relationship peace above equitable dynamics. I set the phone aside without responding. Tomorrow's meeting would provide ample opportunity to demonstrate that capitulation was no longer my default mode. James wanted to discuss Wilson Consulting's tenancy in the Grayson building separate from our divorce proceedings, positioning it as a straightforward business matter rather than a component of our marital dissolution. I had no intention of artificially separating these aspects of our intertwined lives. The company's location in my building, like so many elements of our shared history, existed within the complex web of personal and professional connections we had established over 20 years. Attempting to isolate business considerations from personal ones was merely another strategy to maintain control over the narrative, and another opportunity for me to demonstrate that our interaction would proceed on fundamentally different terms than before. As evening settled over Hartford, I opened my laptop to review financial documents in preparation for tomorrow's discussion. The work was detailed and demanding, requiring focused attention and analytical clarity. Yet beneath the practical preparation, a deeper process was unfolding, the continuing emergence of a woman who no longer defined herself in relation to her husband's expectations or comfort. This transformation wasn't simply a reaction to betrayal. It was the natural unfolding of capabilities and perspectives that had always existed, patiently waiting for space to fully express themselves without accommodation or apology. Tomorrow would bring another opportunity to embody this emerging self, not through confrontation or vindictiveness, but through the simple power of standing firmly in my own truth, undiminished by someone else's limitations. The Riverside Cafe occupied the ground floor of a recently renovated historic building overlooking the Connecticut River. Its floor-to-ceiling windows and outdoor terrace made it a popular location for business lunches and early evening cocktails. Public, enough to discourage emotional displays while offering sufficient privacy for meaningful conversation. I had selected it deliberately for our meeting, knowing its visibility in Hartford's business community would require James to maintain professional composure regardless of the discussion's direction. I arrived 15 minutes early, secured a corner table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and the river, and ordered sparkling water. The positioning was strategic. I would see James enter while remaining partially obscured until he approached the table. This small advantage allowed me to observe his demeanor before he adjusted it for our interaction. James arrived precisely at 3:00 p.m., dressed in the charcoal suit he favored for important client meetings. His deliberate punctuality, neither early, which might suggest eagerness, nor late, which could be interpreted as passive aggression, reflected his awareness that every aspect of our interaction now carried significance beyond its surface appearance. I watched him scan the room, noting the calculated neutrality of his expression and the slight tension in his shoulders. When he spotted me, the mask slipped momentarily, revealing a complex mixture of emotions: frustration, wariness, and something that might have been regret before his professional facade reasserted itself. "Rebecca," he greeted me, taking the seat across from mine. "Thank you for meeting." "Of course," I replied pleasantly, "though I'm curious why you felt this conversation couldn't wait until Friday's settlement conference." He signaled to the server ordering coffee before responding. The lease situation requires immediate attention. The uncertainty is already causing operational concerns. Clients have noticed increased security protocols in the building, and several key team members have expressed anxiety about potential relocation. Understandable reactions to a changing circumstance, I observed. Change often creates temporary discomfort, especially when it's unexpected. James's expression tightened at my deliberate echo of phrases he had often used when implementing corporate restructuring that negatively impacted employees. The subtle reminder that his own management philosophy was now being applied to his situation clearly registered. "This isn't about philosophical approaches to change management," he countered once the server had delivered his coffee and departed. "It's about preventing unnecessary business disruption during what's already a challenging personal transition." "I'm interested in your framing," I replied. "You position the company's lease status as separate from our divorce proceedings, a distinct business matter requiring isolated resolution, when in fact, these circumstances are inextricably connected." "They don't need to be," James argued, leaning forward slightly. "We could establish a clean boundary. Personal matters handled through divorce proceedings, business operations maintained through standard commercial arrangements." I studied him, recognizing the negotiating tactic he often employed with clients, proposing an artificial separation of interrelated issues to isolate and neutralize challenging components. It was effective when the other party accepted his proposed framework. I had no intention of doing so. "That's an appealing simplification," I acknowledged. "But it ignores the reality that Wilson Consulting's favorable lease terms were directly connected to our marital relationship. The company benefited from rental rates approximately 40% below market value for comparable properties, with exceptional flexibility regarding space modifications and expansion options. Those terms represented my contribution to the company's growth, unacknowledged but substantial." James's expression hardened. "If you're suggesting those terms constituted some form of investment in the company—" "I'm not suggesting anything," I interrupted calmly. "I'm stating facts. The lease terms provided Wilson Consulting with an operational advantage valued at approximately $4.2 million over the past 5 years. That advantage was extended based on personal considerations that no longer apply. And now you're using that position to extract concessions in our divorce settlement," he concluded, anger briefly overcoming his professional demeanor. "No," I corrected. "I'm recognizing that all aspects of our relationship, personal, financial, and professional, require reassessment following your decision to end our marriage. The revised lease terms simply reflect commercial reality without the personal considerations that previously influenced them." James took a deliberate sip of coffee, using the moment to recalibrate his approach. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to pragmatic problem-solving, another familiar negotiating technique. "Let's focus on practical solutions," he suggested. "Wilson Consulting has been a model tenant for 5 years. We've invested significantly in customizing the space to our operational needs. A phase-in period for the rate increase would allow us to adapt without disrupting client service or employee stability." "A reasonable proposal," I acknowledged. "What timeline do you envision?" His expression brightened slightly at this apparent concession. 18 months would be appropriate. A graduated increase implemented quarterly until we reach the new rate. "And what additional considerations would you offer to justify such an extended adjustment period?" James hesitated, clearly unprepared for this counter. "Additional considerations?" "Yes," I explained patiently. "In commercial negotiations, extended accommodation typically requires compensatory value. What are you prepared to offer in exchange for the significant financial concession you're requesting?" His momentary confusion revealed how fundamentally our dynamic had shifted. Throughout our marriage, my accommodations had been freely given, expected rather than earned. The notion that his requests would now require reciprocal value represented a paradigm shift he had not fully internalized. The company would be willing to cover building improvement costs directly related to our tenancy, he offered after a moment's consideration. Lobby renovations, security upgrades, perhaps enhanced amenities for all building occupants. Those improvements primarily benefit Wilson Consulting while creating only incidental value for other tenants, I observed. A more balanced exchange might include equity considerations. Equity? James repeated, wariness evident in his tone. What exactly are you proposing? A 3-phase implementation of rate increases over 12 months rather than 18, I clarified, in exchange for a 10% ownership interest in Wilson Consulting transferred to Meridian Investments. His reaction was immediate and visceral, the controlled professional facade cracking to reveal genuine alarm. That's completely unreasonable. The company isn't part of this negotiation. On the contrary, I replied calmly, Wilson Consulting has been central to our marital economy for 20 years. Its growth was facilitated by numerous contributions I made both directly and indirectly. The company's success is as much a product of our partnership as any other asset we developed. Together. James leaned back, studying me with new calculation. You've clearly discussed this approach with Vanessa Carrington. This is her standard strategy, leveraging operational pressure to force equity concessions. Actually, this suggestion came from my independent assessment of appropriate value exchange, I corrected, though I'm sure Vanessa would approve of its effectiveness. The board would never approve transferring ownership interest as part of a lease negotiation, he argued. It would constitute breach of fiduciary duty. The board, I noted mildly, consists of yourself, your college roommate Thomas, and your brother-in-law Michael. I suspect they would approve whatever resolution you recommended to avoid destabilizing the company during this critical period. His expression confirmed my assessment. The board had always functioned as a rubber stamp for James's decisions rather than a true governing body. Like many aspects of Wilson Consulting, its formal structure masked the reality of James's complete control. This is precisely why I wanted to address the lease situation separately from divorce proceedings, he said, frustration evident in his tone. You're using commercial leverage to force concessions on marital assets. I'm recognizing the integrated nature of our personal and professional lives, I countered. Something you seem determined to artificially separate when it serves your interests. James fell silent, reassessing his position. I watched him work through calculations behind his carefully neutral expression, weighing operational disruption against equity concession, immediate financial impact against long-term ownership dilution. 5%, he offered finally. Transferred to your personal ownership, not Meridian Investments, with standard minority shareholder protections, but no voting rights or operational influence. 8% to Meridian with proportional voting rights, I countered. And immediate board observer status transitioning to full board membership upon completion of our divorce. His eyes narrowed slightly. You want a seat on the board. Why would you want operational involvement in the company? Not operational? Involvement, I clarified. Governance oversight proportional to investment interest. Standard practice for significant minority shareholders in privately held companies. James studied me with an expression I hadn't seen before, a mixture of frustration, reluctant respect, and genuine puzzlement. When did you develop this level of expertise in corporate governance structures? You've never shown interest in these aspects of the business. I've always had interest and knowledge in these areas, James, I replied evenly. I simply didn't express them in ways that might challenge your assumption of superior expertise. Our marriage functioned more smoothly when I allowed you to believe your business acumen was unmatched within our relationship. The truth of this statement visibly impacted him. For perhaps the first time, He was truly seeing the woman he had married, rather than the supporting character he had cast in his life narrative. The realization seemed to momentarily unbalance him, forcing reconsideration of countless interactions, decisions, and conversations throughout our 20 years together. 7% equity interest to Meridian, he said finally. Board observer status only, no voting rights, and lease rate increases implemented over 9 months rather than 12. I allowed a moment of consideration before responding. Acceptable, with 2 additional conditions. First, Meridian receives right of first refusal on any future equity sales. Second, the settlement agreement includes explicit acknowledgement of my contributions to Wilson Consulting's development, both financial and strategic. The second condition was not about practical advantage but recognition, formal documentation of the role I had played in building the company James had always characterized as solely his achievement. His hesitation revealed how significant this acknowledgement felt to him, perhaps more challenging than the financial concessions. The right of first refusal is reasonable, he acknowledged reluctantly. The explicit acknowledgement seems unnecessary for a business transaction. It's not unnecessary to me, I stated simply. Recognition of contribution isn't a negotiable element. James studied me for a long moment before nodding once, sharply. Fine. I'll have legal draft the terms for review before Friday's settlement conference. I'd prefer joint drafting, I countered. Representatives from both sides working together rather than exchanging revisions. Again, his surprise at my assertiveness was evident. Throughout our marriage, I had typically accepted his preferred processes, adapting to his established methods rather than proposing alternatives. Each small assertion of equal standing in our negotiation represented another shift in our fundamental dynamic. That's acceptable, he conceded, checking his watch. I have another appointment at 4:30. Is there anything else we need to address today? Just one matter, I replied. Melissa's employment status. His expression instantly hardened. That's completely off limits. Personnel decisions at Wilson Consulting are not subject to negotiation in our divorce. I'm not suggesting they should be, I clarified. I'm simply noting that her continued presence creates unnecessary complications for reasonable business interaction between Wilson Consulting and Meridian Investments as a significant property owner and now minority shareholder. Are you actually demanding I terminate her employment as part of our settlement? His tone conveyed genuine disbelief. Not at all, I replied calmly. I'm observing that her position as your executive assistant creates potential conflicts of interest and communication challenges now that our relationship has fundamentally changed. A lateral move to another department would resolve those concerns while maintaining her employment. James stared at me, clearly torn between defensive protection of his relationship with Melissa and recognition of the legitimate business concern I had raised. I'll consider appropriate restructuring of administrative functions, he said finally. But that's a corporate decision, not a divorce settlement component. Of course, I agreed pleasantly. I'm simply highlighting considerations relevant to our ongoing business relationship, which will continue regardless of our marital status. As we concluded our meeting, James stood to leave, then hesitated. You've changed, he observed, studying me with a mixture of wariness and something approaching respect. Not really, I corrected him. I've simply stopped moderating aspects of myself that made you uncomfortable. What you're seeing isn't change, but revelation. He absorbed this, clearly reassessing countless interactions throughout our marriage. For what it's worth, he said finally, I regret that I never knew this version of you during our marriage. I regret that too, I acknowledged truthfully. But I bear equal responsibility for that reality. I chose accommodation over authenticity, harmony over honest expression. Those choices served purposes at the time, but they're no longer necessary or beneficial. As James walked away, I remained at the table, watching river patterns through the cafe's expansive windows. Our conversation had accomplished more than resolving the immediate business concerns regarding Wilson Consulting's tenancy in the Grayson building. It had established a new foundation for our interactions going forward, one based on direct communication, mutual recognition, and acknowledgement of equal standing. More significantly, it had allowed me to embody the unmoderated version of myself in direct interaction with the person for whom I had most consistently diminished my capabilities. The experience was both challenging and liberating, requiring conscious resistance of ingrained patterns while opening space for more authentic expression. My phone vibrated with a message from Vanessa. "Updates from today's meeting?" I sent. A brief summary of the terms we had negotiated, knowing she would immediately recognize how favorable they were compared to typical outcomes in similar situations. Her response came quickly. "Impressive positioning. He's recognizing the actual balance of leverage. We'll incorporate these terms into Friday's comprehensive approach." As I gathered my belongings to leave, I noticed an email notification from Elaine. "Dinner tonight? I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday and have a proposal I'd like to discuss." I confirmed the dinner plan before driving back to the hotel, curious about what Elaine might have in mind. Our conversation the previous day had been illuminating, helping me articulate aspects of my marriage and self-concealment that I had never fully examined. Elaine's perspective, both professional and personal, had offered valuable insights into patterns I had accepted without conscious recognition. The hotel suite had begun to feel like a transition space, neither the marital home I had left behind nor the new environment I would eventually establish. Its neutrality served a purpose during this liminal period, providing physical separation that reinforced psychological boundaries while major decisions were navigated. I spent the remaining hours before dinner reviewing documentation for Friday's settlement conference, focusing particularly on valuation analyses for Wilson Consulting. The company's financial statements revealed patterns characteristic of James's management approach: aggressive recognition of potential growth while minimizing risk factors, optimistic projections presented as conservative estimates. These tendencies had served him well in building client relationships and investor confidence, but created vulnerabilities in contexts requiring rigorous verification. Vanessa had engaged forensic accountants to develop alternate valuation models, based on more conservative interpretations of the same data. Their preliminary findings suggested the company's actual value might be 15–20% lower than publicly claimed figures, when realistic risk factors and market conditions were properly weighted. This analysis would provide significant leverage in negotiating ownership percentages and financial settlements. By the time I left to meet Elaine for dinner, I had developed a comprehensive understanding of Wilson Consulting's financial position, an understanding that likely exceeded James's own grasp of certain technical aspects. This knowledge differential represented another shift in our relationship dynamic, one that would become increasingly apparent as divorce proceedings progressed. Elaine had selected one of Hartford's newest restaurants for our dinner, a ya-by-ta farm-to-table concept established by a nationally recognized chef who had returned to his hometown after success in New York. The choice seemed deliberate, offering an environment entirely unconnected to my history with James, a space without associations or memories. "You look energized," she observed as I joined her at a corner table overlooking the restaurant's herb garden. "Negotiation must have gone well." "Better than expected," I confirmed, describing the meeting's outcomes as we ordered drinks. "James seems to be recognizing the actual power dynamics at play, though not without resistance." "Not surprising," Elaine noted. "He's built his self-concept around being the strategic mastermind in your relationship. Acknowledging your equal or superior capabilities in certain domains threatens that identity structure." Her observation captured something essential about our marital dynamic: the careful balance I had maintained to protect James's perception of himself as the primary strategist and decision-maker. That protection had become so habitual, I had ceased to recognize its presence in our daily interactions. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Elaine continued after our drinks arrived, particularly about visibility and professional identity in your next chapter. That's actually why I wanted to meet tonight. Your message mentioned a proposal, I prompted, curious about her direction. Yes, she confirmed, her expression shifting to focused enthusiasm. The Downtown Development Commission has an immediate opening for a new board member. The previous appointee relocated unexpectedly, creating a mid-term vacancy that needs to be filled within 30 days. That's the public-private partnership, overseeing the riverfront revitalization project? I clarified, immediately interested. The commission had been established to coordinate Hartford's ambitious plan to transform the previously industrial riverfront into a mixed-use district combining commercial, residential, and cultural elements. Exactly, Elaine confirmed. 15 board members representing various stakeholder groups, city government, business interests, neighborhood associations, cultural institutions. They provide strategic direction for the entire revitalization initiative, including approval of major development proposals and allocation of public funding components. And you're suggesting I pursue this appointment? I'm doing more than suggesting, Elaine replied with a small smile. As current commission chair, I've already proposed you as a candidate to the nominating committee. Your property ownership in the affected area makes you an eligible stakeholder, and your financial expertise would fill a critical gap in the current board composition. The opportunity she described aligned perfectly with my emerging vision for professional engagement beyond divorce proceedings. The commission represented exactly the type of meaningful involvement I had been considering: influence in community, development based on substantive expertise rather than social connection. The timing seems significant, I observed. This role would establish a public identity completely separate from my marriage, just as that relationship is formally dissolving. Precisely, Elaine agreed. It positions you as Rebecca Harrington, financial strategist and property developer, rather than Rebecca Wilson, corporate wife. The impact extends beyond personal satisfaction to practical considerations regarding professional reputation and community standing. What's the selection process? I asked, already mentally assessing the opportunity's feasibility alongside other transitions underway. The nominating committee reviews candidates next week, with full commission vote scheduled for the following Tuesday. If approved, you would begin immediately with the monthly planning session on Thursday. The accelerated timeline was both challenging and appealing, requiring immediate focus during an already complex period while offering swift establishment of a new professional identity, coinciding with the formal end of my marriage. Would my ongoing divorce proceedings create complications for the appointment? I asked, considering potential objections. Quite the opposite, Elaine replied. Several committee members have expressed concerns about downtown property owners being inadequately represented in recent discussions. Your qualification is based on objective criteria, commercial property ownership and financial expertise, entirely separate from personal circumstances. As we continued discussing the opportunity through dinner, my initial interest deepened into genuine enthusiasm. The commission role represented more than simply professional engagement. It offered meaningful participation in shaping Hartford's future development, influencing decisions that would impact the community for decades. The nominating committee would need your formal expression of interest by Monday, Elaine explained as we concluded our meal. A brief letter outlining relevant qualifications and perspective on downtown development. Nothing elaborate. 2 pages maximum. I'll prepare it this weekend, I confirmed, already formulating key points to emphasize. As we parted outside the restaurant, Elaine embraced me warmly. This is just the beginning, Rebecca. The opportunities opening before you extend far beyond. What was possible within the constraints of your marriage Not because James actively prevented your growth, but because the relationship itself required compromises that limited your full expression. Her perspective captured something essential about the transition I was navigating. The end of my marriage represented loss in certain dimensions, but expansion in others. The challenge lay in fully recognizing and embracing those expansive possibilities, rather than focusing exclusively on what was ending. Driving back to the hotel, I found myself contemplating the accelerating pace of transformation in my life. In just over a week, fundamental aspects of my identity and daily existence had shifted dramatically. From married woman to independent individual, from background supporter to visible participant, from accommodating wife to assertive negotiator. These changes weren't entirely new creations, but rather revelations of capabilities and perspectives that had existed beneath carefully maintained accommodations. The woman emerging through this transition wasn't a stranger to me, but a more complete expression of who I had always been beneath adaptive behaviors developed to maintain marital harmony. Tomorrow would bring the settlement conference with James, Vanessa, and the opposing legal team. Another step in formulating the practical terms of our separation. But beyond those necessary logistics lay more significant questions about who Rebecca Harrington would become when no longer defined primarily in relation to James Wilson. The Downtown Development Commission opportunity represented one answer to those questions, a concrete avenue for expressing capabilities previously, kept carefully modulated. Other possibilities would emerge as this transition continued, each one offering choices about which aspects of myself would receive full expression in this next chapter. As I prepared for sleep in the quiet hotel room, I felt a curious sense of anticipation beneath the inevitable stress of ongoing legal proceedings and emotional processing. This anticipation wasn't about finalizing divorce terms or securing favorable financial outcomes, but about the gradual unveiling of a self no longer constrained by relationship accommodations, the emergence of the woman I had always been beneath, carefully maintained compromises. Vanessa Carrington's conference room projected subtle power through understated elegance. The custom mahogany table that dominated the space could comfortably seat 12, though today only 6 places were set. 3, on each side, creating clear demarcation between opposing teams. Fresh flowers adorned the credenza, their subtle fragrance masking the typical staleness of enclosed meeting spaces. The lighting was deliberately calibrated, bright enough for detailed document review without the harsh glare that might exacerbate tension during difficult negotiations. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled start time to review strategy with Vanessa and her associate, a meticulous young attorney named Marcus Chen, who specialized in forensic financial analysis. My navy suit, tailored precisely to my measurements rather than the slightly looser fit James had always preferred, felt like appropriate armor for the day's discussions. The framework from yesterday's meeting provides excellent momentum, Vanessa noted as we settled at our side of the table. James has essentially acknowledged your contributions to Wilson Consulting's growth, which undermines their core position regarding separate business assets. He also revealed significant concern about operational disruption during the Westlake integration, I added. That suggests additional leverage beyond the Grayson building lease situation. Vanessa nodded appreciatively. Excellent observation. We'll explore that angle if needed. She turned to a substantial leather portfolio. Let's review our primary objectives and acceptable compromise positions before they arrive. For the next 20 minutes, we methodically confirmed priorities, established boundaries for potential concessions, and refined response strategies for likely counterarguments. The process was focused and efficient, each scenario examined through multiple perspectives to anticipate potential developments. At precisely 9:55 a.m., Vanessa's assistant announced the arrival of James and his legal team. The calculated timing, 5 minutes before the scheduled start, represented neither premature eagerness nor disrespectful delay. Every aspect of this interaction carried symbolic weight, each detail carefully managed to project specific impressions. James entered first, followed by Lawrence Brennan and Caroline Mueller. His expression revealed nothing as he nodded a brief acknowledgement in my direction before taking his seat. The attorneys exchanged professional greetings with Vanessa and Marcus, the practiced cordiality of adversaries familiar with ritual courtesies that preceded determined opposition. "Thank you all for convening on relatively short notice," Vanessa began once everyone was seated. "As previously discussed, our objective today is to establish a comprehensive framework for equitable dissolution of marriage that recognizes both disclosed and undisclosed assets accumulated during the 20-year union of Rebecca Harrington and James Wilson. The deliberate use of my maiden name wasn't lost on anyone present. It established from the outset that this discussion concerned not just the division of physical assets, but the separation of identities previously conjoined through marriage." Lawrence Brennan, a carefully groomed man in his early 60s with the practiced affability of someone accustomed to easing difficult situations, leaned forward slightly. "We appreciate the opportunity for this preliminary discussion. Our client has expressed strong preference for amicable resolution that minimizes disruption to both parties' professional and personal interests." Vanessa's smile was polite but measured. "Certainly. Amicable resolution begins with complete transparency regarding all assets subject to equitable division. We've prepared comprehensive documentation of our client's separate and marital property for immediate disclosure." She gestured to Marcus, who distributed bound presentations to everyone present. "You'll find complete financial statements, property evaluations, investment portfolios, and retirement account details with appropriate supporting documentation. We expect reciprocal disclosure before substantive negotiation proceeds." The strategic value of immediate, comprehensive disclosure was twofold. It established a tone of transparent cooperation while simultaneously applying pressure for corresponding openness from James's side. The contrast between our prepared documentation and whatever they had assembled would be immediately apparent. Lawrence accepted the materials with practiced cordiality, though the slight tightening around his eyes suggested he recognized the tactical advantage we had established. "We've prepared preliminary disclosure as well, though perhaps not with the same level of detail. We can certainly provide supplementary documentation as discussions progress." "That would be counterproductive," Vanessa replied pleasantly but firmly. "Meaningful negotiation requires complete understanding of all assets subject to division. Incremental disclosure creates unnecessary delays and potentially undermines good faith dialogue." Caroline Muller, previously silent, joined the conversation. "Our client has legitimate concerns about sensitive business information being utilized for purposes beyond equitable division of marital assets. Wilson Consulting's financial structure includes proprietary methodologies and client relationships that require appropriate protection." Her intervention was strategically sound, attempting to establish business confidentiality as justification for limited disclosure. The approach was standard practice when one party controlled closely held business interests that might be subject to claims during divorce proceedings. "Those concerns are easily addressed through standard confidentiality provisions," Vanessa countered smoothly, "which we've already incorporated into the proposed settlement framework on page 4 of the materials provided. Our client has no interest in disrupting Wilson Consulting's operations or client relationships beyond ensuring appropriate recognition of her contributions to the company's development and current valuation." Throughout this exchange, James remained silent, his expression carefully neutral as he reviewed the documentation we had provided. I recognized the slight tension in his jaw that typically indicated strategic recalculation, reassessment of his position based on unexpected developments. "Perhaps we could begin with areas of potential agreement," Lawrence suggested, adopting a conciliatory tone. "The residential property at 45 Lakeview Drive, for example. Our client has indicated willingness to transfer full ownership to Ms. Harrington, including assumption of the minimal remaining mortgage obligation." This opening gambit was predictable, offering a seemingly significant concession that actually represented minimal financial impact. The house, while valuable, constituted less than 8% of our total marital assets. Moreover, James had already indicated he had no interest in maintaining the property during our initial confrontation. "That's an appropriate starting point," Vanessa acknowledged, though we should note the property's current market valuation of $1.85 million represents a significant reduction from potential value due to deferred maintenance issues identified. In the recent inspection report included in our disclosure materials, this subtle counter established that we wouldn't accept surface valuations without proper examination, a principle that would become increasingly relevant as we discussed more complex assets. For the next hour, discussion proceeded through relatively straightforward components of our marital estate: personal property, vehicles, artwork, and standard investment accounts. These elements, while substantial in aggregate, were clearly documented and subject to established division principles under Connecticut law. Throughout these preliminary discussions, James remained minimally engaged, offering occasional clarification regarding specific assets, but primarily allowing his attorneys to manage the interaction. His restrained participation suggested he was conserving energy for the more significant negotiations regarding Wilson Consulting and my recently revealed separate assets. At 11:30 a.m., Vanessa strategically shifted the conversation's direction. "Now that we've established preliminary agreement on these standard elements, let's address the more complex components requiring specialized valuation approaches, specifically ownership interests in closely held business entities." The subtle tension that had been building in the room immediately intensified. This transition represented the core conflict underlying our divorce, not simply the division of obvious assets, but the recognition of contributions and interests that James had consistently minimized throughout our marriage. Caroline straightened almost imperceptibly, her expression sharpening as she moved into her area of specialized expertise. Before discussing specific valuations, we should establish appropriate methodologies. Business interests developed primarily through one spouse's professional expertise and industry relationships require different approaches than passive investments. "We agree completely," Vanessa replied with calculated pleasantness, "which is why our valuation of Wilson Consulting incorporates multiple methodological approaches, not just standard income capitalization and asset-based calculations, but comprehensive analysis of how marital contributions from both partners facilitated the company's current market position." She gestured to a specific section in the materials previously distributed. "You'll note our analysis documents numerous specific instances where Rebecca's direct and indirect contributions materially impacted the company's development. Initial capitalization from her separate property, facilitation of key client relationships, through her social network and operational support during critical growth phases." James finally broke his relative silence. "Those contributions, while appreciated, don't constitute operational involvement or expertise development. They represent standard spousal support during company growth." His characterization, diminishing my role to standard spousal support, was so familiar it almost made me smile. Throughout our marriage, James had consistently reframed my substantive contributions as peripheral assistance, reinforcing the narrative that Wilson Consulting's success stemmed exclusively from his business acumen. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.